Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining our UQ ChangeMakers webinar series. I'm your host, Anita Heiss, author and Professor of Communications here at the University of Queensland. These are very special events with equally special guests that include you, alumni from around the globe, and of course our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Debbie Terry, and her guests, as well as leading UQ academics. They're all here to talk about the trending issues that are important to you. Welcome everyone to our first ChangeMaker event of 2021, Black Lives Matter, the Australian context. On behalf of UQ, I'd like to say in my own Wiradjuri language, Marangiria, Yinjamaradu, Mianjangu, Mangu. Good evening. I pay my respects to the traditional owners and caretakers of country here in Mianjan, Brisbane, where I'm speaking to you from tonight. We are joined this evening by 827 people from 33 countries, including Antarctica. Now you might all be wondering why UQ has decided to address this topic tonight. As moderator of the ChangeMakers series and someone who marched in the Brisbane Black Lives Matter demonstrations with other UQ staff and students, I put forward this issue because I believe it's important for UQ and other educational institutions to address it. Myself and my colleagues here alongside me, including the Vice-Chancellor, believe this conversation is critical in moving forward towards social justice, and we are really pleased to see so many of you join us online. As you know, tonight's topic explores the Australian experience with the Black Lives Matter movement. When African-American man George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis police custody on May 25, 2020, his death catalysed a movement that grabbed the attention of the entire world. For many Australians, it forced us to hold a mirror to our own country and look at the black lives that have been lost and taken because of racism. Like George Floyd and the countless other deaths in the US, we said their names loudly in the streets. David Dungay Jr., Tanya Day, Ms. Du. But these Indigenous Australians are just three of the 444 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have died in police custody in the 30 years since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. No one has ever been convicted for their deaths, and few of the 339 recommendations of the Royal Commission have been implemented. Devastatingly, in the last 10 days leading up to this broadcast, there have been 3 more deaths in custody. At the same time this week, we've had the family of 2 boys who drowned in Perth re-traumatised by the inquest into their deaths. Also, the family of Mr Reynolds, who died in 2018, was left without justice after the inquest findings into his death were handed down this week. In the past 30 years, the stories of these men and women have largely been overlooked. But in June 2020, those protests, it felt like the country was finally starting to listen. On June 6th, I was one of over 30,000 people who gathered in Brisbane's King George Square to protest about Indigenous deaths in custody. But as anyone who has been involved with the Black Lives Matter movement in Australia can tell you, the issue runs far deeper than deaths in custody. It touches on all injustices Indigenous peoples face, from disproportionate incarceration rates to racism in the healthcare sector and intergenerational trauma. The increased national interest in the movement was immediately obvious, but the issues aren't new. Here in Australia, Indigenous peoples have been talking about racism for generations. So why has it taken the death of a black man overseas to bring to light the injustices that have affected First Nations peoples since the point of first contact? Tonight's discussion will explore the issues Black Lives Matter has brought to the fore in Australia, including deaths in custody and wrongful conviction, but also broader inequality. Our panellists will be discussing how race manifests in their fields, healthcare, academia and media, and if education holds the key to improving outcomes for Indigenous Australians, what are the tangible, productive ways to move forward as individuals and as a community? Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers this evening. We will be hearing first from UQ's Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Deborah Terry. Debbie is currently Chair of the Board of Universities Australia and an appointed member of the ARC Advisory Council, amongst many other roles. Debbie began her distinguished career at UQ in 1990 and she rejoined us last year in 2020. Our panellists this evening are Associate Professor Chelsea Watego, Amy McQuire and Frances Nona. Chelsea Watego is a Mununjali and South Sea Islander woman and an Associate Professor with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit at UQ. She has worked as an Aboriginal health worker and researcher in communities across southeast Queensland for the past 20 years, with her current research examining how race and racism operate within the health system in producing the persisting health disparities experienced by Indigenous peoples. Amy McQuire is a Darumbal and South Sea Islander journalist and UQ PhD candidate investigating media representations of violence against women. Alongside her journalistic career, she has spent the past 4 years co-hosting the investigative podcast Curtin, which puts forth the case for innocence for Aboriginal man Kevin Henry, who was wrongfully convicted in 1992. Frances Nona is a Torres Strait Islander man from Bardu Island and a lecturer in UQ's School of Public Health. Previously, he was clinic manager and acting CEO in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisation in regional Queensland. He's a registered nurse and has worked in a youth detention centre, rural hospital, rehabilitation and aged care settings, and is currently completing his Masters of Public Health alongside his lecturing commitments. Before we hear from our panellists, I'd like to recognise with respect the families of the 444 Indigenous people who have died in police custody, as well as the families of those who have been wrongfully incarcerated and faced discriminatory violence. This is an important conversation to have, but at the heart of it is real trauma. Debbie, I'd like to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Anita, for your introduction. Before I share my thoughts, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. We honour their elders and their continuing cultural and spiritual connection to this land as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. Just picking up on Anita's opening remarks, I think it's important that our discussion this evening is focused squarely on the Australian context for the Black Lives Matter movement. After all, while this movement has its origins in the US, we have a distinctly different historical and cultural context for race relations here in Australia compared to the Americans. And on this issue, creating a better understanding of Australian history is absolutely vital to making progress. As a nation, we need to develop a better appreciation of Indigenous peoples and their concerns, while also gaining a better understanding of how non-Indigenous peoples have come to know and relate to Indigenous peoples. In our Australian context, the tragedy of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis brought a renewed focus to the ongoing national shame of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody. It also focused our attention on the sad reality that Indigenous Australians are proportionately the most incarcerated people on earth. While these are distressing issues to discuss, it's critically important that we face them honestly as individuals and as a nation. This notion is captured in part in UQ's Reconciliation Action Plan, which expresses our desire to shape the future by understanding our past and present. And a very similar point is made in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The Statement from the Heart expresses the aspiration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have, and I quote, a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. The way I see it, the growing unrest around the 26th of January as our National Day is evidence that a change is already underway. The increasing prominence of that debate indicates that Australians are becoming more prepared to look critically at our own history. There's an increasing willingness to understand the history of colonisation and its ongoing impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. While the discussion can at times be uncomfortable for some people, the very fact that we're having the conversation is a positive step on the path to reconciliation. I see this ChangeMakers session in that same vein. For some, this evening's conversation will be affirming or validating. For others, it will be confronting or even unsettling. But that's not a reason to shy away from it. As individuals and as a nation, we need to understand our history. Understanding our past and truth-telling should be core business for UQ. It should be something that we work on and continually get better at. After all, truth is a notion that's chiselled above the entry to UQ's historical front door, the Forgan Smith building, where it says, "Great is truth and mighty above all things." As a university, we're proud to be hosting this ChangeMakers session for our alumni community. I hope it's an opportunity to gain some new perspectives, and in so doing, I hope it helps to push all of us that little bit further down the path to reconciliation. I'll now hand back to you, Anita, to get the discussion underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Now, to start this evening's discussion, it's important to dissect what the Black Lives Matter movement means here in Australia. I'm going to ask each panellist from each of your perspectives, what are some of the core issues around race in your respective fields, and what are you and other Indigenous peoples doing to resist against them? Francis, might you start, please?
I've seen the core issues both in my personal life and my professional life. Personally, the battleground was on the streets and neighbourhoods where I grew up, and living in West End where cheap housing was, and then feeling Expo 88 was coming to town and they were trying to move the black bodies of urban Indigenous out of town so that the world could see that it looked free. 12 years later, the same thing happened in 2000 with the Olympics. So we see this growing up going, we're dictated to be moved along when it suits for people to see. Professionally, I have witnessed the gap in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, the interpretation of Western versus Indigenous health literacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I have also seen the lack of cultural safety and even overt racism in the healthcare system. I believe that improving the health system for Indigenous Australian is not just the work of Indigenous people. It should be part of everyone's role.
Thank you, Francis. I'm going to move round onto Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, look, when we think about deaths in custody, there's a broader conversation here to be had around deaths in the colony, and working in health, a place that claims to care for those who come through its doors. We see in the deaths in custody and the coronial inquiries the failings not just of a justice system, the violence not just of the legal system, but a violence of a healthcare system that still refuses to care for blackfellas in this country, despite this claim or this vision of a health system free of racism. And I want to acknowledge the important scholarship of one of my PhD students, Ms Helena Kijlik, who has unprecedented access right now to the National Coronial Inquiry database. And she was able to identify over 4,000 preventable deaths of Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system post-2000. Wow. Of that, we see around 400 make coronial inquiries. And then we get to the coronial inquiry and what we see is coroners finding that there are deficiencies in healthcare, yet deeming that to be natural causes. And Amy pointed out just last week on the drum that there's nothing natural about these deaths in custody. But living in a social world that's predicated upon the idea that we were destined to die, it's all perfectly natural for these violent systems. And so the role then, I think, of health professionals and health researchers in this time of closing the gap where we're claiming to care, we have to be very explicit about how race operates in the systems that employ us.
Thank you, Chelsea. There's so much there already in our first two panel members. We're going to plough through this. I know questions are already coming in. And Amy, what about your experience then?
Yeah, I mean, just from even beginning my journalism career, I began in the wake of pretty much the year that was leading up to the NT intervention, which was the most racist government policy in recent memory, was incredibly media driven. And so I see, I've come to view journalism and media as a structure of racism in itself. and the way Mob talked about the way black witnesses are treated, the way when we talk about death in custodies and the violence of the justice system, the way that the media position police and corrections and people in power as authoritative sources over the testimonies of blackfellas. I think that's been a huge problem, the way Aboriginal people have been seen as unworthy of grief and unworthy of mourning, unworthy of being believed. And families have to come out and do so much work just to be believed. And the media is incredibly complicit in that. So a lot of my work has been about actively resisting that through black media, and particularly through the case in my hometown of an Aboriginal man named Kevin Henry, who was wrongfully convicted of murder back in 1992 and only was released on jail and parole last year. The large reason that he was wrongfully convicted was not just the shoddy police investigation, not just the racism that saw him seen as a black savage perpetrator, which he was not, but also the dehumanisation and devaluing of the victim, who was an Aboriginal woman named Linda, and the fact that justice system, the media, all these systems combined did not view her worthy enough of justice, and the media is a key part of that. So that's what I try and actively resist through my work, through recentering the testimony of the black witness, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal families, as a way, and I think so often the media can actually be a force of violence in relation to that.
If you think about the issues the three of you just raised in terms of media, justice and the health system, and I think we're all here because we believe that things can change and we desperately hope things can change for the better for our people. As a society, how can we move productively forward? What steps can our different industries, places of education, healthcare, the media, how can we move forward to ensure that change does happen? Francis?
Sure. As I work in health and the tertiary education systems, I'd like to comment on both. In both healthcare and education, there needs to be an authentic space for Indigenous voices. Often Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander input is only tokenistic, and the changes needs to happen now. Genuine change needs to be Indigenous-led. Education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is integral to our participation in systemic change. It took 116 years from the first establishment of the first Australian university in 1850 until the first Indigenous Australian, Charles Perkins, graduated in 1966. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in 2017, there was 48,711 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a tertiary qualification. This is exciting, but more needs to still be done. Researchers needed to listen to Indigenous research methodologies and be wary of cultural bias, misleading statistics and the deficit lens. In healthcare, there needs to be an appreciation of Indigenous knowledges and ways of doing things. The Western way isn't automatically right. There are more than one way of doing things, and for a lot of people, the Western way doesn't actually work. Example, health for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is defined beyond Western definition of disease and includes complex connections with spirituality, community and country. It is also important to understand that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and nations have different languages and different cultural beliefs.
Thank you, Francis. So much there we could flow on with and talk about. I just want to move on to Chelsea though, if I may, right now. Chelsea?
Sure. I think there's an important conversation at the moment about truth-telling, about racism, but I'm also a big fan about truth-telling around race. And race has been foundational to this place. So I'm not all that optimistic about progress and change. The truth is this place is so deeply committed to race as a structure of repression. And what we know about race, it's about power. So that's not something that's readily ceded and handed over. What I'm interested in as an academic and the work that I do is understanding race better so that we strategize around it. And that we think, instead of looking at how do we teach people how to treat us as human beings, is how do we compel the state to change? How do we compel the state to be accountable to blackfellas that it refuses to care for time and time again? And I think that's the work that we need to be doing. This is an ongoing fight. It's not something that we can readily move on from. And I don't think that, I don't believe that we're going to have a mountaintop moment where we transcend race in this place. That doesn't mean I don't have a purposeful living. That doesn't mean that I accept race passively. For me, it's about how do we build the intellectual army in our communities that is already there, but strengthen that to continue to fight this frontier that we're on. And race is the battleground. And unfortunately, in the academy here, there is not the support for the race scholarship that's needed to really prove that Black Lives Matter in this place.
Thank you. I think the understanding race and strategising around that is something we could delve into deeper if we come back and we have time. But right now I'm going to throw to Amy, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Chelsea has said, particularly in relation to the media, because when there are all these conversations about racism in the media, it's always crouched around diversity and the need to get more blackfellas into the media. We've seen time and time again that the mainstream media can be incredibly traumatic for Aboriginal journalists and Aboriginal media workers. And I've come to think that the way, even just journalistic norms and ways of telling stories, they can be in direct opposition to Indigenous ways of storytelling. Particularly when we look at the reporting around death in custody, it's ultimately set up to support the sources, you know, police sources, people who are in power. And so I feel that it's about building up a strong, independent black media that can contest that. And black media has a fundamentally different role than white media. It's not just about telling the stories, not just about ensuring Aboriginal voices are put first and foremost. It's also about fighting sometimes mainstream media, recorrecting mainstream media, but also using it as a tool for advocacy, which is traditionally, I don't think, what journalism sort of sees itself as. And so for me, it's not even about being absorbed into mainstream media, it's about building up our own solid Aboriginal media who can be of service to our communities directly, rather than what we're seeing currently in relation to mainstream media.
Thank you, Amy. I'm just trying to scribble notes as they're all talking, and I think with so much you were trying to get through this evening in an hour, and you may not think there's a thread, but we're talking about language and power and voice and who has that, and rights and our rights to be believed. We're talking about, you know, belief and so forth. And I know there's lots of questions and comments coming in as we speak, and we're going to get to as many as possible. But two of the main comments we often hear, and I'm sure many of our viewers online tonight have heard this themselves, maybe they've said it themselves, and that is, this is on America. How is George Floyd's death relevant to us? And of course there's that phrase that all lives matter that we often hear. Now I'm wondering if each of you could have, how would you approach addressing these comments, as it were? Chelsea, do you mind starting?
Well, look, I don't even like approaching these comments. They're just, you know, the reality is that an Aboriginal man here screamed the words, "I can't breathe," repeatedly before he was killed in custody over a packet of biscuits. So how dare people suggest that this is not an issue here when it happened here first? And I think it's shameful that people don't know what's happening. The family fought for that CCTV footage to be released. How could you not see that footage? What's happening here in our country? You know, racism is something that people love to see elsewhere. It's kind of like the Loch Ness Monster. It's somewhere out there, but it's never right here, and no one's ever cited it really. And it's here. It's every day. We've got families outside coroner's courts nearly every week appealing for care from the state, whether it's in a hospital ward, in an emergency room, a prison cell, a river, like everywhere. To not be aware that Black Lives Matter is foundational to this place, in a place that decided that we didn't even exist and is still legally committed to that we don't exist here. You know, it's the fact that we'd even have to answer that kind of question is deeply offensive and an insult to the families who are still waiting on justice.
Absolutely. And Amy, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, Australians just do not want to see the violence perpetrated against Aboriginal people within prison walls, within the hospital system, within child protection, because they're complicit in this violence. And so they do want to outsource their outrage overseas. And I think what we saw in relation to Black Lives Matter, it was very performative. You know, I don't know, I just still feel that Aboriginal lives still are not seen as, I don't know what to say really.
As valuable,
Yeah.
as significant, as important, as relevant, as
As
worthy
human.
as everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's the continuing settler colony, and we don't talk about it in relation to settler colonialism. And there are continual deaths. I mean, Chelsea was just talking about the coronial inquests we've just had recently, and it can feel incredibly relentless. And often, you know, we talk about the numbers in ways that is expected to shock Australia, but what should shock Australia is every one of these cases. You know, when Miss Stew was shown being dragged across the floor, you know, that footage should never have had to be released, but I remember it was released around December, and just it didn't create, you know, the outrage that it should have. And so I think the fact that Aboriginal families have to continue just displaying the wounds of their loved ones in order to make Australia care is incredibly obscene, when we know the reason why this continually happens. And the fact we're 30 years after a Royal Commission, you know, incarceration rates continue to rise, and in fact we have politically popular law and order policies that are put in place. You know, it just shows that a lot of the politicking and a lot of the discourse is just a lie, because fundamentally it's about the fact that to Australia they prefer, you know, our presence on this land is threatening. It threatens everything about this country. And that's the fundamental point. And it's why, as Chelsea always talks about, you know, and Dr. David Singh, it's why we have to look about race in this place and what's happening in this place. And Australians would prefer to look overseas and pretend that it's not happening here, or if it is happening here, it's not as bad, you know, putting it on this hierarchy, when, you know, this is very particular to Australia and Australian racism.
Thank you, Amy. Francis, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. Since the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody in Australia, only half of the recommendations have been implemented to all, and another 444 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have died in custody. While this is not the United States of America, there are systemic issues that impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And there are a disproportionate number of Indigenous Australians, both youth and adult, who are incarcerated. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their perspective be included in the development of policies, research and programs to ensure they are culturally appropriate. Significant improvements to the criminal justice system and policing, including the fair application of law and better targeted support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across health, employment, schooling and infrastructure to address the inequalities outcomes for Indigenous people, especially young people. It is true, all lives do matter. But that statement is deflecting from the fact that Indigenous Australians are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and that's too many that are dying in custody.
Thank you, Francis. Now, we are all at a university, and education is often seen as the solution to a number of systemic issues, including racism in Australia. You know, we can learn, change behaviours. Now, you're all highly educated individuals. How does this expectation on education align with your own experience? And Amy, I'd like to start with you, if I may, please.
Well, I mean, I felt like I had to re-educate myself about the history of this country after I left school. And so my sister is doing a lot of work in relation to, you know, truth-telling, but in ways that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids want to, you know, should be hearing, in ways that, you know, it's a strength-based approach. So I know, I just felt like I learnt so much more after schooling, and it's something that I continue to learn. I think, you know, a lot of Aboriginal kids are growing up hearing different narratives to what they're taught in school, and often schooling can be the site of, you know, violence in itself, and Aboriginal children find very creative and smart ways to resist and to survive every single day is in ways that non-Indigenous kids just don't have to go through. And so I think recognising that while education is very important, that, you know, it can also be, you know, a different experience for Aboriginal kids, I think.
You weren't expecting this question, Amy, but you've just released a book. And is that part of the process of changing the experience for our young kids, particularly in the classroom?
Yeah, definitely. It was about January 26th, so really confronting that amnesia of history, but through Aboriginal ways. So really talking about survival, resistance and sovereignty, and the different ways that Aboriginal families choose to talk about that day. And it was fundamentally written for my children, so they have some of those tools to combat that, you know, when they're confronted with all this myth-making being central to the settler colonial project of Australia. So for me it was some of the most important writing you could do, because it was something I didn't have when I was growing up in Rocky. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And Francis, your experience?
Education has been, for me, a vehicle to change my life, but it's also helped change the lives of many others. When I was a child, I remember sitting in the streets on a Friday afternoon watching the cars go by on their way home. I wondered what jobs were these people, you know, what jobs did they have, where were they going? I later realised that education was the key to an occupation that I could earn money and help others. 32 years later, I was in an acting CEO position in an Indigenous health organisation, and I drove past the very place where I sat as a powerless child. And I reflected on how I'm able to make a different life for my son and my community. So I use education as the vehicle to really strengthen, you know, the next generation. Yeah.
Thank you. Chelsea, I think you might have had a different experience. Do you want to share that?
I guess I would share my experience about coming to race through formal education. And so I did my undergrad and postgrad degrees at the University of Queensland in the School of Population Health. I didn't learn about race. I learnt how to surveil black bodies. I learnt the instruments to use and how to monitor and count, as though somehow our ill health is a product of black lack and the incapabilities of our bodies. And then working in health for 20-something years, I realised, wow, it's the social world that's making us sick, not the deadly choices we make or don't make. And so it struck me that I would come to race so late in my formal education. And the more I read, particularly consumed from the Northern Hemisphere, because that's where all the race theory exists apparently, the more I realised that my father was one of the sharpest race theorists that I had ever met. And I was forced to then revisit my own life and my upbringing and the strategies that I was given to survive and withstand this violent apparatus of oppression that we breathe in every day. And so now my work, if I can be called a race scholar, is to understand how race works from the vantage point of those who are racialised. And no one can offer a richer vantage point on racial violence than blackfellas in this place, both in life and in death. And so I'm particularly interested in how we as blackfellas in this place not just testify to the wounds in our body, but theorise how they came about and what we can do to minimise the violence that comes to the generations that follow us, because race isn't going anywhere.
No. Chelsea, I missed the phrase you used to describe your father.
He's a race theorist.
The original, or that you
he's one of the sharpest. You know,
sharpest.
And I read stuff from overseas, and I'd read what black people have said from overseas. But I'd return to my words of my father and things that we were given that. And all black families have this, the things that we're told at our kitchen table about who we are, about never forgetting who we are and where we come from, about holding our heads up high, you know, and just these things, these everyday things we just thought were everyday things, but they're what our old people, our ancestors gave us to survive in this place. And that's the thing, right, is that in the settler colonial state, the end goal is that we forget who we are and where we came from. And blackfellas via race are refusing that every day. And as violent as it is, there is beauty and power and strength in black resistance as well.
And that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask each of you now. So you talked about your father as the sharpest race theorist and resistance fighters. And we come, as you say, from a community of resistance fighters, warriors. For the purpose of tonight, we're change makers. I wanted to ask you all about celebrating some of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders that have been out there making a difference. It's a difficult question, I know, because everyone is going to say, why didn't they pick me? No, gammon. Who has been one of, if not the most, important black change maker in your life? Francis, can you tell us who yours is, please?
I want to first acknowledge the 3 black women that I sit on this panel with, leading the front and taking on what needs to be taken on so that we can follow through. But I will take it back to Torres Straits. For me, Eddie Koiki Mabo is a leader who inspires me, a fellow Torres Strait Islander man who was a warrior for our people. He was able to fight the long-held lie of terra nullius through the Australian court system, recognising our country and our connection.
You know, Francis, I think there's probably a lot of people watching tonight who are nodding with you, and that Eddie Koiki Mabo is probably their great change maker as well. Aside from your father, Chelsea, who is your change maker?
I'm going to cheat here. So I'm going to say every single Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman in this place. I was just tweeting the other week about people say we're the backbone, but we're the front line. So all of them. But if I name one, I also want to name the late John Newfong. Now he's a journalist, but I met him via his writing as a 17-year-old, my first year at uni at the University of Queensland, where I read his foreword to the National Aboriginal Health Strategy. Now that strategy was 1989, the first National Aboriginal Health Strategy in the history of this country, right? And I encountered his words at 17, and it just grounded me in so many ways in terms of understanding the source of our ill health, that it's not because there's something wrong with us, there's something deeply unhealthy about the society in which we're forced to live in. But the style of his writing, it was bold, it was courageous, and it was truthful. And I've never seen, in all of the health policies and Indigenous plans and things that have followed since then, that kind of courageous black scholarship in a document like that. And what's really, I think, tragic is that, so many years on, there are so many more of us in positions of power, yet the scholarship isn't as courageous as what it once was. So for me, encountering his words at that time just helped shape for me what a black intellectual could and should be doing for our people.
Thank you so much. And Amy, I know, is a fan, as was I, as a writer of John Newfong. But Amy, who did you choose tonight?
Yeah, I couldn't stop, but I felt like you chose more than one person. So Uncle Tiger Bells, of course, because I think when we just talk about, he was such a legend in Aboriginal activism, but also Aboriginal media particularly. And I just felt, his voice was so, I don't know how to describe it, but very, everyone knew Uncle Tiger's voice. But I think his power is that he understood there was no one voice. And he cultivated so many Aboriginal mob, but particularly women. He supported women so much, and I think it was from his mother. And so I just always felt supported, and I just have learnt so much just from being able to watch him, work with him, and just know about his legacy. And the other one is, the other change maker, I think, is Judy Atkinson, who has just been so fundamental for me in understanding trauma and violence. Her work, her book Trauma Trails, has been incredibly helpful to me, but also she's just so generous with her time and with her knowledge, and she continually just shares and is, just doing the work right now. And for me, I think those two have just been so important for me in my own work and my own learning, and just understanding what's actually happening right now in this place. So.
Oh, thank you. I'm hoping all the alumni watching are going to be tonight and tomorrow and in the weeks to come Googling all these amazing people in our community. Debbie,
Yes.
I'd like Debbie to appear on our screen if we can. There we go.
Absolutely.
We lived without Zoom for tens of thousands of years, and now...
No, and I'd obviously like to acknowledge not only all of our panellists here, today for the impact that they're having in each of their different areas, and of course you as well, Anita. But I'd like to call out Professor Bronwyn Fredericks. She's one of our senior colleagues at the University of Queensland. She's Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Engagement. She has huge impact, not only through her own writing and through her research, but through her leadership at the University of Queensland. It is really quite phenomenal. She's obviously a leader in relation to ensuring that the university stays on track in relation to the implementation of our Reconciliation Action Plan. She has a huge impact on our Indigenous students and their success, and also on our, and we've recently just launched as a university, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research and Innovation Strategy, and Bronwyn had real leadership in relation to that the development of that strategy. So I'd really like to acknowledge her and thank her for all of the contributions she makes to the university. But on the national scene, she's also very prominent and has an impact much more broadly than the university.
Absolutely, and I'm sure there's many alumni that have had some communication, some connection with Bronwyn as well, with Professor Fredericks, I should say. And if it's okay with the panel, I'd like to add my own ChangeMaker to the list. And as an author concerned about First Nations voices being heard broadly, I would say that one of my greatest black changemakers was the late Aunty Ruby Langford Ginnaby, Bundjalung woman who pushed the boundaries of publishing back in the 80s, ensuring that our voices were heard our way. She insisted, when her autobiography was published, Don't Take Your Love to Town, that her voice was not sanitised for white audiences. Or as she said to her editor, do not gubberise my text. Aunty Ruby changed the way that academia critiqued our writing and how Australian students heard our voices in the classroom. And for that, I think she was an absolute change maker. Now, we'd also like to know from the audience who the most important black change maker has been in your life. Let us know on social media with the hashtag #UQChangeMakers. Now, before we turn to audience questions, and they are coming in these changemaker panels, we like to leave our viewers with ways that they themselves can be part of the change that we know is necessary. What can our individual alumni do to promote social justice in Australia? A call to action, if you will. Take it away, Chelsea.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Oh, sorry. So what can our alumni do to be part of change as individuals, and also as a cohort, like a call to action? How can we promote? How can our alumni? What can they do to promote social justice in Australia?
I think just, I guess, taking off Amy's point, believe black people when they speak up about race and racism, firstly. Be as courageous as black people are about race and racism so that we don't have to be. And do the readings. Don't exhaust the labour of black people, do the educative work, because the reality is race isn't about not having read the manual. It's an oppressive structure that works for certain people and that's violent for others. And so I think we have to be honest and truthful about how race works, and people have to take responsibility for that, for their own complicity, and be as committed to eliminating racism as an action, not just as this kind of virtue signalling statement. It needs to be in the doing, and unfortunately it's black people that are doing all of that right now. So it's time to step up.
Yeah. When you were speaking, Chelsea, I was thinking it's quite often the same in the reconciliation movement, that we are expected, and we do, all the heavy lifting every day. And it's as you said, it's not just virtual signalling, it's not just tweeting and retweeting, it's turning up, it's standing up, it's doing the reading. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and being as unpopular as what we are. You know, being prepared to be at the margins just like the black race scholar is. Paying the price for it, because it comes at a cost. But we do it because we know the price that is being paid for blackfellas right now is far bigger than anything that we're experiencing.
And Francis, what's your call to action? What should people be doing?
I firstly just want to be grateful for the opportunities that the University of Queensland have given me and the Faculty of Medicine within where I work in the School of Public Health. University supporting Indigenous students. This is a stream that I've come through. And students can really make a difference. As alumni and the people within the audience, you can help by supporting scholarships for Indigenous students. Authentically listening to our voices and calling out racism when you see it. Think about how the systems that you work in and what part does that play with systemic racism and how this can be changed if we work together.
Oh, thank you, Francis. And Amy?
Chelsea was talking about paying the price. I would say give money. If you really want to help in a practical sense, one of the issues that a lot of families face is that there's this enormous financial cost even before it gets to inquests. You know, in America they have a lot of resources to be able to run these cases that are really important, not just for advocacy, but actually when the cases go to the inquest or pushing to get them to court. That's one of the things, like, why does Australia start, you know, if you want to help, there's actually practical ways you can help. Look at Debbie Kilroy's campaign. We have a GoFundMe for Kevin Henry. There's so many campaigns for families who are currently dealing with death in custodies. They actually need your money, you know, not just your support, not just a hashtag on Twitter, but actual money. So I think that's one of the most practical things you can do alongside educating yourself, alongside listening to mob, doing all of these other things, actually put your wallet where your mouth is.
There's some really simple things there from the panel tonight. Read, listen to Indigenous voices, support Indigenous students, be more critical of the mainstream media, donate, and if you're not sure what to read, where to donate, please follow our panellists on social media and they've got all the links that you can go to. All of it's doable. Now if we can turn to our audience questions. Our first question is from Philippa, who asks, how can you sustain the rage or momentum of something like Black Lives Matter in the Australian context? Amy, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aboriginal, but the thing with Black Lives Matter and, you know, the outrage that we saw and the rallies that we saw is that Aboriginal families had already been protesting for years and years. You know, they'd already been fighting to force people to listen. And we've seen over, you know, after that wave had gone, that there was that moving on, which I find, you know, a lot of that original show of support was quite performative. So I don't know how we maintain the rage because Aboriginal people still have the rage and we still have that anger. It's just about non-Indigenous Australia has to actually step up and start understanding that all of this work is being done. Largely the burden has been on families, and I just find that really horrendous, you know, the fact that there's this enormous burden and that still there's such apathy and ignorance from wider Australia. So I don't know how to continue to get Australia to care. All I know is that blackfellas continue to fight. Yeah, so I don't know how to keep the rage going because blackfellas, you know, anger, you know, the anger has never gone away.
I think perhaps we've got all, you know, 800 people watching tonight, but hopefully more online as the weeks go ahead. And if you're listening and you're hearing, you're understanding and you're taking note of the language and the grief and the trauma that continues to be perpetuated through black deaths in custody and through systemic racism, particularly in the health system and so forth, then if you arm yourself with knowledge, then you can help participate and take some of the burden, which is a word that we've heard a few times, the burden that is on Aboriginal people and families to get to fight for justice. Okay, well there's a question now from Denise, and it's for me. Thank you, Denise. I understand that the National Justice Project represented your family after the death of your cousin Naomi Williams, and they also work around black deaths in custody. Can you speak a little of their work? Thank you for your question, Denise. It is true that the National Justice Project, led by George Newhouse, represented my family in seeking justice for my cousin Naomi Williams, who died in 2016 at the age of 27, and she was 22 weeks pregnant. After a long history of systemic racism within Tumut Hospital, Naomi had been finally turned away with Panadol, only to pass away at home hours later with treatable septicemia. Now the NJP fought for the coronial inquest to find answers and to ensure that there are sweeping changes to New South Wales health, and most importantly for my family is that no other family suffers what we do. The NJP fights for justice, fairness and inclusivity by striving to eradicate systemic discrimination through the power of strategic legal action, education and advocacy. But aside from working against racial discrimination in health, some of it has been with Chelsea. Their work also includes taking on cases of police violence or discrimination against First Nations peoples, including representing the families of David Dungay Jr, Miss Du and Miss Tanya Day. They also act on behalf of the mother of Mr Morrison, who died in custody in South Australia, and the mother of Joyce Clark, who was shot by police in Western Australia at the age of 29. This not-for-profit has also created an app called CopWatch. They worked with Amy on what is an education program and an app for the Aboriginal Australian community to help improve engagement, trust and accountability, most importantly, between police and Aboriginal people. The CopWatch app lets you record interactions with police safely and legally. So I do urge people to check out the National Justice Project website. Okay, the next question is for Francis. Now Francis, Mia asks, how can I explain Indigenous issues to my family who are prone to the "I didn't do it to them" argument?
Yeah, wow. Let's state a fact here. From the far north to the south, out to the west to the east, everyone is on stolen land. It's the truth of the matter. And as of such, benefit from the dispossession of the traditional owners who had more than 60,000 years relationship with this land and that we now call Australia. Current and historical policies continue to disadvantage Indigenous Australians. Being silent is being complicit with the systemic injustice. Non-Indigenous Australians need to hear the voices of Indigenous peoples, and we need to work together to all be change makers.
Thanks, Francis. Actually, that phrase being complicit has been used a lot tonight as well. So maybe if people look inwards and ask themselves, am I being complicit in the situation? That's a way to gauge about how to move forward as well. Thank you. The next question is for Chelsea. As academics, what are the ways we can demonstrate and lead positive societal change in the area of Indigenous engagement and empowerment?
Study race. Understand how race operates in the disciplines that we've been trained in, and work to undermine it. In my career in the academy, I don't think I've encountered one research question that in its first iteration didn't start at some point with the premise, what's wrong with black people? Under the guise of empowerment, emancipation and closing the gap. You know, the academy is the place that made race, made it real, and it's still committed to racialised thinking, and our students encounter it in classrooms. I encounter it as an academic. The texts are still there, they're violent. So every discipline has work to do around race. It's not something, the race scholarship should not sit at the margins in an Aboriginal studies unit. It needs to be across the whole university, every discipline, understanding the complicity, the construction of race and race thinking within their own disciplines, the way in which it's rationalised as part of the natural order of things, because there's a relationship between that and the coronial inquiries that find natural causes. Unfortunately, we don't have the kind of courage there in the Australian Academy when it comes to race. And as someone who tries to study it and talk about it, I'm just surprised that there isn't this intellectual curiosity about it. Here in Australia, there's this resistance to attend to race, even though it's foundational to this place. We have to ask ourselves why. Why can you not study race in this place? What is that about? And how are universities complicit in that silencing?
I have so many questions around that, Chelsea, that could go for another hour. But unfortunately, that last question that went to you brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. And I'd like to thank Debbie and Chelsea and Francis and Amy for their time, as well as you, our amazing alumni from around the world, for joining us to learn from some brilliant change makers in our Aboriginal and Torres Islander community. Tonight's conversation is a springboard to greater action that's driven now by you. We'll be in touch tomorrow to summarise all of these important actions provided by our speakers together in one article that you can share with your family, your friends, your colleagues, on how they can be part of creating change. We'll also be including a list of some recommended reading and viewing from University of Queensland Press and our panellists to assist you in your conversations moving forward. And leaving you now, I'd like to acknowledge the strength of black people who continue to rise with pride and with hope and expectation of justice. And in the words of poet Romaine Morton from the Darumbal, Yarraga, Minjabal, Bunjalung people of Stradbroke Island, I've witnessed the falling of many, heard them cry and hear them still. Even with grief inside me growing, I command my spirit to rise and surprise you by my will. And for all people, we are here and we are many, and we will surprise you by our will. Thank you for joining us this evening. Stay safe wherever you are. Good night.